Good morning, everybody. We are here to talk about the determinants of schizophrenia. So let's get started. Right. So the reason why we're talking about schizophrenia today instead of some other mental illness is because this is a really good model for the interaction between biological and environmental aspects of schizophrenia. Okay, so this is where we're headed. We're going to cover all of these different topics. It's going to take us only about 15 or 20 minutes to do this, but there is more to learn in pretty much all of these topics. And if you are particularly interested in anything that comes up, please do reach out. I'm more than happy to discuss it with you. Okay, so very briefly, let's talk a little bit about what schizophrenia is. Your book and of course psychiatry.org, which is the American Psychiatric Association website, discusses schizophrenia in detail, but in a very general sense, you need to have one of the following: delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. There's a little star by hallucinations there because there are some modifiers around this. If your hallucinations involve more than one voice talking to each other, for example, you don't need any other symptoms to meet criteria. So anyway, there is a lot more to the criteria than what is on this slide, but this is the general set of ideas. So there's a very important part to this, which is that there needs to be a marked decrease in daily functioning since onset. That basically means that, you need to be struggling to meet your own needs in some way, and often it's every way. Often people go from being pretty functional, jobs and school and all of that, to not really being able to take showers anymore, or definitely not go to work or school or anything like that. I think it is also worth noting that in the DSM-5, which is the last revision to the criteria for schizophrenia, we're on the 5TR right now, which is basically the same book but with a few tweaks. In the DSM-5, they removed the subtypes of schizophrenia. So there were these subtypes: paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, undifferentiated, and residual. And they removed these because they were not very valid. They did not hold up in real life, and they didn't accurately describe folks. Because basically the bottom line is people change over time, and you can start with one subtype and then look quite different in a few weeks or months or years. So they remove the subtypes. That doesn't mean that subtypes don't exist necessarily. It just means that you don't use them for formal diagnosis. Okay, so how does a schizophrenic brain work? So there are some very clear differences between a schizophrenic brain and a non-schizophrenic brain. There are changes in each type of matter in the brain. So the gray matter diminishment leads to increased thinking and judgment challenges. In general, there are other things that impacts, but those are two of the big ones. And white matter changes as well. And basically what that means is that there's almost no aspect of the person that is unaffected. The thing that I really want to emphasize here is that brains with schizophrenia are marked by excessive dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. Glutamate also plays a role, but prefrontal cortex is the place where we are learning about judgment and executive function. We discussed executive function several times, but also last week. And the prefrontal cortex is developing into young adulthood. And if something goes wrong, then you can be very vulnerable to various mental illnesses before it's completed. So it's usually completed about the age of 25. So pharmacology that decreases dopamine decreases symptoms, but over medication can lead to Parkinsonian symptoms. So what does that mean? It means that on one end of dopamine, you have schizophrenia, and on the other end of dopamine, you have Parkinson's. So that should tell you that this disease in the body is the symptoms are mediated very much by dopamine, right? And so you can impact the symptoms by impacting dopamine. That also means that if you increase dopamine, so something that you already have in excess, if you make it more excessive, you're going to make symptoms worse. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So, the risk factors for schizophrenia, there are a lot of them. I just pulled out a few of the more significant ones. The most important risk factor for schizophrenia is having a family member with schizophrenia. So the more DNA that you share, the greater chance it is that you will have schizophrenia also. In the general population, your risk of schizophrenia is about 1%. In identical twins, it's 48%. So that should tell you that the heritability is quite high, which, as you go further out, so identical twins share 100% of DNA. Normal fraternal twins or other siblings, full siblings, share about 50% of DNA. And then it goes out from there, right? And so your heritability goes down with the more distance that you have from the DNA overlap. Okay, so there are all sorts of cool charts that you can find on this on the internet that if you're interested you can look. The risk is really striking to see if you look at that. The other risk factors for schizophrenia, trauma and stress, like I pulled out a few of these. And the childhood separation from parents is a really interesting one. If you are separated from your parents before the age of 16 for a year or more, I believe it is your risk goes up by 300%. And let's talk a little bit about what that means. So if your risk is 1% and it goes up by 300%, then you're looking at what? Right, 3%, 4%. You're not looking at make sure you do your math correctly is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, bullying, financial instability, social instability, those fall into the category of trauma and stress. Adverse childhood experiences, which we've also discussed, all of those fall into trauma and stress. Migration as a minority and discrimination in general, these are interesting ones. If you migrate, let's say that you are of African descent and you migrate to another country where the demographics are similar. So you go from one African country to another. That doesn't really have any impact on your risk factor for schizophrenia. However, if you are migrating from an African country to, say, England or the United States or the Netherlands or somewhere where the racial and ethnic makeup is quite different, then your risk goes up significantly. And in the research, what this ended up boiling down to was discrimination, and the risk for discrimination and the experience of discrimination is the real risk factor here. So cannabis and amphetamines, really, really big risk factor here. And that goes back to this, right? It goes back to the dopamine situation, because cannabis and amphetamines stimulate the same neurons that receive dopamine. And so even though it's not real dopamine, it to the brain, it thinks it is, right? And it has the same impact. So basically what you're doing, to as far as your brain knows, is you're increasing dopamine, which means you're increasing your risk. Really, for the brain that is susceptible to schizophrenia, we want to decrease dopamine, not increase it. I also want to point out here that we are not talking about the part of the brain that talks about pleasure, right? So that's a different part of the brain. That is not the prefrontal cortex. And so, dopamine has a lot of different roles in our brain, but in the prefrontal cortex, it's not about pleasure. So, decreasing dopamine in the prefrontal cortex doesn't have anything to do with decreasing pleasure. Now, can we focus our drugs and treatment on that? No, not necessarily, but I just want to make that distinction. Birth month, really interesting one. Okay, so in the Northern Hemisphere, I believe it is, you have the highest risk in March and December, I believe it is, and the lowest risk if you're born in September. And if you are in the Southern Hemisphere, it's flipped around. Why is this? No idea. There are a lot of theories about this, about viruses, about allergies in the mother, all sorts of things. But there's no actual known reason. Obstetric complications. So we have discussed previously that there are some things that will impact your epigenetics. So that is how your genes are expressed in the world without actually changing what the makeup of your genome is. It will change how your genome is expressed. And so there are some that are like that, so there was a study about a cohort of pregnant people who gave birth in a famine, and their children had all sorts of interesting outcomes later in life, like much later in life, not necessarily as babies, right? And schizophrenia was one of them, right? So it can be subtle like that, or it can be obvious, like an actual trauma during birth that damages the brain, that will increase your risk also for schizophrenia. Being born in and also living in a city, so both of those components are required. This increases your risk a lot. This actually comprises about 30% of your risk, this one thing. And what that is about is not the city itself. It is about the trauma and stress of living in a city, right? So if you think about the multitude of stressors that exist in a city that don't exist in other settings, so that is poses a risk. Also, there are a lot of pollutants, for example. So there's a lot of things about living in a city that pose a risk. Okay, so this lecture is called Biological and Environmental Aspects of Schizophrenia. So why are these factors not labeled as biological or environmental aspects, right? Like, why do we not have headings? These are biological, these are environmental. And that's for a really good reason, which is that, pardon me, we cannot really pull these things apart. Okay, so you need both. right? You need both a genetic predisposition and an environmental stressor in order for there to be many illnesses in general, but definitely mental illnesses, okay? And sometimes the genetic component is more, and sometimes the environmental component is more. We're going to look at that in a slightly different way on the next slide. But these two things add up, right? Sometimes, you have that 48% genetic predisposition, right? And then it doesn't take a whole lot of environmental stressor to push you over the edge into illness, right? But what if your genetic predisposition is 1%, right? Then you need a whole lot of environmental stressors, right? So it's going to be different for each person, and it's not going to be as easy as saying, biology or environment. It just doesn't work like that. So here's another way of looking at this. And I said this again, right? So sometimes the genetic component is a bigger piece and requires a smaller stressor. Sometimes the environmental component is a bigger piece and requires a smaller genetic vulnerability, right? So I showed you a couple of different ways that this could look with my little pie charts here, right? So, it all is going to end up with illness, right? If you fill up that circle, you're going to end up with illness, right? But if you don't have a lot of genetic vulnerability, or you don't have a lot of environmental stressors, you're not going to fill up the whole circle, and then you're not going to be ill, right? Okay. So to expand the model into schizophrenia in general, it's actually a little more complex than this. So you have a genetic predisposition, right? So you have the family members with schizophrenia. The more DNA you share, the greater the chance that you will come down with schizophrenia. And in identical twins, as we discussed, it's 48%. Plus some environmental stressor, or a multitude of environmental stressors. Very rarely it's just one, right? And then you have to, in the case of schizophrenia, you have the opportunity to subtract from that mitigators, right? And specifically with regard to schizophrenia, the mitigators are early intervention programs, proper treatment, and proper support. So what does that mean? Early intervention programs that address folks who are experiencing symptoms that suggest that they might be developing schizophrenia are very effective. If you can prevent somebody from having their first full-blown psychotic episode, sometimes you can prevent psychosis and the development of schizophrenia in general, right? And that this is a huge, huge value to the person and also to society, right? And so early intervention programs are really, really important. And I also want to point out that early intervention programs are environmental, right? They provide a environmental support that balances out the environmental stressor, but they can also involve medication. However, the research shows that medication, and like preventative medication for psychosis, doesn't work. It's not useful. All it really does is create side effects. It doesn't stop you from developing psychotic symptoms. So those early intervention programs are basically an environmental balance to a biological risk, right? An environmental risk, both of those things, right? So anyway, you might still develop illness. That is true, but you might develop lesser illness. You might develop no illness. It depends, right? It depends how much of this you have, whether it can overwhelm the mitigating factors or not. All right. So if you have any questions, please do let me know. And there is going to be an extra credit assignment attached to this lecture. So I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.